right, well, my name's Jim McLaughlin. I'm a U.S. National Chess Master. We're going to cover tactics for this class, last about an hour, and we're going to focus on the pinning idea. You pin a piece, it can't move, you attack it with hopefully with a pawn or other pieces, and hopefully you win it. So that's the basic idea. Okay, we're going to start with some fairly simple examples, but for the experienced players it should get more interesting later on. This first example, you can see it's white to move, and you should notice right away that the black knight and the black king are on the same file, the E file. So it's simple. White only has one piece that could possibly pin anything, the rook. So the key move is rook to E1. Pinning the knight can't move or it would be check on the king. So the knight can't move, you have to protect it. The king can't protect it, so the only move for black is to move his pawn up 2 squares and protect the pawn. So one reason pinning is such a good attacking method is that it immobilizes the pinned piece. So the knight on E4 can't move. Once you get a piece that's immobilized, it's easier to attack it with pawns or other pieces. Now, to win the piece, you have to attack it. It's defended once, so you have to attack it at least twice. And fortunately, in this example, we have a handy pawn on D2 that can move up 1 square and attack the knight. The knight can't move, so the knight is lost and white wins. So this is the basic idea of a pin. The knight can't move because it's check. We win the knight and we win the game.
If you don't take the rook.
Good point. I hadn't thought of that. I overlook simple things like that sometimes. Okay, so we'll go on to the next example. Well, I wanted to mention all these examples are taken from a chess book by a German, Siegbert Terrasch. He wrote a chess book called The Game of Chess. He has great examples in there on how to do different tactics. He has a whole section on pinning. These are all taken from that book. It was written back in 1935. Siegbert Terrasch was a contender for the World Championship. He played Emanuel Lasker in a match, but he didn't win. He lost the match. But anyway, he was a very good player. Okay, so this is the second example. I know my experienced players can see the pin right off the bat. Do any of the young boys see how to pin a piece here? What would the move be? Right. So the knight, the thing to look is you see the knight and the king are on that black diagonal. That means if we happen to have a bishop that's on a black square, which we do, we can move the bishop and pin the knight. Now there's only one move to protect the knight. Again, what would be that move?
King to F6.
Right. And now, remember, once you pin it, you look to see if you have another piece or pawn that can attack it. So, do you see a pawn that can attack the knight, and what would the move be?
F4.
F4, very good. Very good. So once again, a simple example, but this time it was a diagonal pin. The other pin was on a file by a rook, now a bishop. Most pins are done by bishops and rooks, and sometimes the queen, but the most effective ones are by bishops and rooks. So, there's no way to save the piece. White wins the game. Okay. Now we should get a little more complicated idea. This position doesn't have a pin immediately, and it requires an inaccurate move or two by black, so we'll just move into it. Well, white moves the rook over to the black moves the rook over to attack the pawn and to keep it from advancing to get a queen, and the knight attacks the pawn. Now, white moves the rook over to the d file to attack the knight, and he sets a little trap for black. And because this is an example on pinning, black falls right into the trap and makes a double question mark, or a very bad move, and he takes that pawn on e5. Who sees the pin now? What's the move?
Rook to d8.
No, it's on, the rook is on the first row. See the 1? And these are the files. Which file does it go to pin the knight?
Rook e1.
Right, rook to e1. So it just moves over one square. Notice that the knight, if the knight could move and check the king, he could get out of the pin, but the king's on a white square, the knight's on a black square, meaning the knight has to move to a white square. So right off the bat, you know that he can't check the king because he's moving to the same color as the king, and there would be no check. Also, the important thing is the king can't move up and protect the knight. And the other thing is the knight can't move and protect the rook because the rook is on a white square, and again, the knight moves to a white square. But the author points out, want you to imagine this in your head. Let's see. Oh, if the black rook was on e6, the white square in front of the knight, would that save black? Is there a move that would save black in that case? Now, I would expect my more advanced students to say yay or nay. Ken?
What was the question? I'm sorry.
Assume that rook on e8 is on e6 right in front of the knight. Okay? So it's on the white square in front of the knight. You got that? Can black save the game or not?
No.
Are you sure?
On e6, the king doesn't get there in time, does it?
Yeah, but look, the knight counterattacks. What is the knight attacking? The bishop. And is it the bishop with check?
Oh, okay, yes, okay.
And from f4, it would get the rook on e6, wouldn't it? So, cute little subtle point. So actually, if the rook was on e6, black could save the day by moving his knight back, and white would have nothing better than to retreat his bishop and protect his rook. So that's an interesting little nugget in tactics, but okay. So that's the kind of thing you have to look for. All right. Yeah, so the knight would retreat to g6 and see how it attacks the bishop on f4. Or using this arrow, the knight would retreat here to the white square, 2 squares in front of the king, g6, and it would attack the bishop. And notice that it takes the bishop with check, gaining a move to take the white rook, which would have taken the black rook when the knight moved. Rook takes rook on e6, you see that? Then knight takes bishop check, the king moves, and the knight moves back to e6 and takes the rook. And actually, that would win for black. Because of that, the best move for white is to give up trying to win anything, retreat his bishop, and try to hold an endgame a pawn down. And he might do it with the bishop versus the knight. Sometimes those are draws. Okay, let's go to the next example. Obviously, this is more complicated. There's quite a number of pieces There's a rook, a queen, and a minor piece, a bishop for white, a knight for black. And let's see, white, how many pawns does white have?
6.
And how many does black have? Other things being equal, then white's a pawn up, right?
Yes.
Okay, but in this case it doesn't mean that much because number one, see how it's a double pawn? And double pawns are usually weak. But this game doesn't depend on the pawn play anyway. Remember in the last example we had the other side make a really bad move? It's white's turn to make a really bad move here. Notice that black, well, it's black's move. Black takes that pawn on e5. And see how the black knight threatens the queen on f7. Not to mention the fact
It protects the queen
on g4, that's right. Now, the safe move, what would be the safe move for white in this position? Who would like to make a guess about that? Notice there's a pawn hanging on c7. The queen could take the pawn on c7 and threaten queen takes rook checkmate. That looks pretty strong. But that's not the safe move. Who sees the safe move for white? What is it? Yeah, that's basically what the author says. To protect the bishop and those weak white squares around the king, because the queen and knight are threatening to come in on f3. If the queen moves off, it could be very dangerous. So you're right. I think the author said like queen to f4 because then he would threaten to trade queens and attack the knight at the same time, but the same idea. Okay, but white blunders here and takes the pawn. He thinks he likes that checkmate threat, and he's attacking the knight on e5. You see that? It's a double attack. But he abandoned his king side, didn't he? So what's the winning move for black? Okay.
I think it's queen
F3? Check?
queen f3.
Okay, you're right. Notice that the queen is checking the king and attacking the bishop. That's another theme of tactics which is covered later in the book, double attack, but it rises here.
Oh, from the beginning I see 2 checks.
There's only one way to save the bishop. What's the move for white?
Rook to e1.
No, the king is in check. He either has to move the king or put a piece between the queen and the king.
Bishop to f2.
Okay, you're right. Now, white is still threatening queen takes rook check, right? So we need to move the rook. Can we move the rook and make a threat at the same time? What move would that be? Don't forget our knight's hanging. If we don't make a threat with the rook, we'll lose the knight. I guess we could do rook to e8 and protect the knight, but there's a better move than that.
We could do knight.
Rook to f8 is the right move. Look, the bishop is pinned. That's our theme, right? Remember, when you have a pinned piece, you want to attack it with another piece or pawn, and the piece we can attack it is the rook. And the threat is queen takes bishop checkmate. Obviously, white doesn't have time to take the knight. Does white? White has to protect the bishop to prevent checkmate. There's only one move. What's that move, Ken?
Queen to c5.
Right. Now remember, I said when you have a pinned piece, you try to attack it with all your pieces and pawns. What is the way to attack it with another piece? What's the move for black? What is it? Knight to g4, absolutely correct. Notice that the queen conveniently protects the rook. So if there's nothing there, this rook, the white rook, is on b1 and it's blocked by pawns, so the white rook cannot protect the bishop. There's no defense. The next move is knight takes bishop, and probably followed by checkmate soon after that. So this is a good example on how strong pins are. Let's go on to the next example. Again, it's not immediately apparent where the pin is in this position, so we have to make a couple moves to go into it. The first move is rook a to d1. Notice now the rook and queen are lined up, and see there's a black queen behind the pawn. If the king wasn't protecting the queen, we would have a good move based on pinning that pawn. What would that move be, Ken?
King takes bishop.
Right. So rook to d1, you see, that's what we call pressure. There's pressure down that d file by the queen and rook. It's attacking and pinning that pawn. Now it is protected by the bishop. But nevertheless, if you don't have a better way to go, you increase the pressure on your opponent, which rook a to d1 is the best move. Now, to show the example of the pin, our author has black make a horrible move. Black wants to get castle to connect his rooks. Usually a good idea, but not in this case. Who sees the winning move? One of the young gentlemen, do you see a good move for white? Remember that pawn's pinned now. If the pawn's pinned, it's not an effective protector. What does the pawn protect? The bishop. So if the pawn's not effective protector, how can we take the bishop? With a piece. The queen, what's that move? Give me the notation. Queen X.
Queen X E5.
Right, and notice what happens if D takes E5. What's the next move? All right, let me do that. D to E5, what's the winning move for white? Right. See, we won a whole bishop. We gave the queen for the bishop. But we got the queen back because the pawn was pinned, and the rook can now, with the line open, the rook can now take the queen. Okay, good. This one isn't the greatest example. It's very simple. And again, it depends on black making a horrible move. So let's go right into it. That's the horrible move. The author says black wants to complete his development, connect his rooks. His next move, he'll bring the rook on A8 over to E1 maybe to protect the pawn, or maybe he'll go to D8 and protect the bishop. That would be a strong position. But what is the drawback to bishop to D7? Who sees a good move for white? And, oh, where's the pin? There's a pin here. Where's the pin? Who sees the pin?
Wait, it's not right done. The G7 pawn.
G7, that's the pawn in front of the king. Notice that the white bishop and the black bishop are on the same diagonal.
Okay.
Is there a piece or pawn between the two bishops?
The E6 pawn.
Yes, that is the pawn that's pinned. If that pawn moves, then bishop takes bishop, right? So what's the winning, well, not winning, but what's the best move for white in this position? D5. NX D5. And notice that if E takes D5, we get the piece back and we won our pawn, utilizing the pin. Now the reason I say this isn't such a hot example notice that even after white won a pawn, black is still 2 pawns ahead. So it's doubtful that white wins, but again, it's just an example. Now, let's see. Oh, this is easy. There's a win for white. Now, when you look at a position for the first time, what you want to do, what I do, I start with the pawns. So first I look at the white pawns, and I see there's 7 of them. Notice that 6 of them are almost back at their starting squares, and there's only one advanced pawn, the pawn on e5. Then look at the white knights. I like to work from the pawns to the knights to the bishop to the higher pieces, the rooks and the queen. So let's look at the white knights. Oh, they don't seem to have been developed yet. Not likely they're going to factor into any kind of tactical combination, is there? Then let's look at the bishops. Develop means you move the piece from its beginning square usually into the middle of the board so it can take key central squares. Okay. So that's what develop means. So the knights are not developed. Now let's look at the bishops.
Unless they do actually develop later.
Well, they will later, but at this point in time, the knights have not moved, right? What's your question?
All I see is just to attack the queen with the bishop.
Bishop to g5. That's not a bad move, but there's a better move. But let's continue analyzing the position because that's important. Look at the white bishops. One bishop has moved up 1 square to e2. Not a bad square, but it's not attacking any black pieces or pawns, is it? So that bishop is not likely to enter into our little tactical combination, is it? All right. Now, obviously, the rooks are hemmed in by pawns and knights, so you can rule the rooks out. That leaves the black squared bishop on c1 that has something, as you pointed out, it can move to g5 and attack the queen. Well, at least it can make an attacking move, right? There are no pawn moves by white to attack anything. Now let's look at black's position. Again, the pawns. Looks to me like there's 7 pawns, 3 in front of the king and 4 on the queen side. So the pawns are the same number on both sides, aren't they? Note that the black pawn on d7 blocks that white squared bishop. Apparently, black doesn't know how to develop his pieces properly. So the bishop can't get out, the white bishops can't get out, he blocks the rook. Now the knights are pretty well placed, they're both in the center. See the knight on d5 and the knight on c6, so I have no problem with them. But I'm not real fond of that black squared bishop. What does that black squared bishop hit?
2 moves, I think I can attack something and develop the bishop.
Well, that's an excellent idea. So that black squared bishop's not doing anything for black.
But it could surprise black by taking something.
All right, now the other point is black is castled. That's about it. Now let's find the winning move. What's the winning move? What is it?
The black bishop to h6.
And what's your threat?
Checkmate with
Queen to xg7. Checkmate. That's a pretty strong threat. I agree. And notice that the pawn on e5 comes in handy. It prevents the black queen from going to f6 where it could defend g7. A pawn in the center advanced to the 5th is a strong attacking pawn. It drives the defensive pieces away from the king. In fact, I bet when white played e5, black moved his knight from f6 to d5. So, not only does it deprive the queen, it drove the knight away from the defense too. The knight could have, if it was on f6, it could have retreated to e8 and protected g7. Interesting little points. There's only one way to stop checkmate. What is it?
G6.
It is G6, but there's a drawback to G6, fairly obvious.
The bishop will take the rook.
That's right. And is the rook worth more than the bishop, or is the bishop worth more than the rook? The pawn is worth 1 point. The bishop and knights are 3, the castles are 5, the queen is 9, and the king isn't valued because if you lose the king, it's checkmate and the game's over. So they don't value the king. But interesting, in the ending, when the queens and rooks are gone and the king doesn't have to worry about being checkmated, the king can move to the middle of the board and support his pawns moving up to get a queen. And the king, because he can move 1 square in any direction, the king is stronger than a knight or a bishop. Did you know that? Yes. So in the ending, the king is an attacking piece. That's why they always move it to the center of the board toward the opposing pawns. Hopefully you can win one. And remember, tactically, you want to win a pawn or a piece. A pawn is usually enough to win the game. Now, to win a pawn or a piece, you have to have at least 2 pieces attacking it. In a complicated game, you may need 3 pieces attacking it because it can be defended more than twice. So that's why you develop your pieces so you can attack your opponent's pawns and pieces with multiple pieces, not 1 or 2. And if you start moving pawns, you waste the opportunity to move your pieces into play, and you're going to be attacked. You're not going to be attacking anybody. Okay, well, that's enough for tonight. Thanks for coming.